As we addressed in last week's video about Max Verstappen, there is a seriously contentious discussion in Formula 1 around who is the greatest driver of all time. And currently, there are two drivers that usually rise above the rest when addressing this debate: Michael Schumacher and Lewis Hamilton. Both guys completely dominated Formula 1 in their respective eras, winning countless races and championships, and so naturally, it has given way for many to compare Michael Schumacher and Lewis Hamilton and debate as to who is the better driver. Some argue it's got to be Schumacher because they believe he faced harder competition or had a relatively less competitive car, while others are on Hamilton's side arguing he has more race wins and a higher win percentage. In this video, I'm going to put forward my argument for this debate, and that is simply there is nothing to argue about because it's impossible to compare Schumacher against Hamilton. I'll explain. Firstly, Lewis Hamilton is a British Formula 1 driver competing for the Mercedes F1 team. He is seen as one of the greatest drivers in the history of the sport, having won a record 7 championships in 2008, 2014, 2015, 2017, 2018, 2019 and 2020. He joined Formula 1 in 2007 for McLaren and was immediately on the pace, winning 4 races and coming second in the championship. He then stayed at McLaren until 2013 when he made the risky move to the unproven Mercedes, where he went on to win 6 out of his 7 championships. Unlike Schumacher, Hamilton is still competing in the sport for Mercedes and will be hoping to push for a record-breaking 8th world title this season. Then we've got Michael Schumacher, who is a retired German racing driver who is widely regarded as one of the greatest Formula 1 drivers in the history of the sport. During his time in Formula 1, Schumacher also won a total of 7 world championships, a record that stood for many years. He is the only driver to have won 5 consecutive championships, a feat that he achieved between 2000 and 2004 while driving for Ferrari. In addition to his championships, Schumacher also holds numerous other records in the sport, including the most fastest laps. Over the course of his career, Schumacher raced for several different teams, including Jordan, Benetton and Ferrari, where he spent the majority of his career and won his 5 out of 7 championships. When people address the debate of Schumacher versus Hamilton, they usually go to the statistics, and when you do, you will see that Hamilton is far superior in this arena. He's got a higher win percentage, higher podium percentage, higher pole position percentage, better average race result and more points per race, with both drivers on the 2021 points system. The only statistic that is in Schumacher's favour is fastest laps, where he has had 77 to Lewis's 61. And in terms of race starts, Schumacher has 306 and Hamilton has 310, so they are both pretty equal in that sense. Right, well logically, based on this, everyone would agree that Hamilton is the better driver as he has achieved much more in his 310 races than Schumacher has in his 306 races. However, it's nowhere near that simple. To explain this, we need to get some context on the environment of Formula 1 and the nature of the drivers during each of their eras. The first aspect is to analyse the competitive climate for each driver. Basically, how good was the rest of the field and were there any obstacles that render these statistics useless for comparison? Well, during Schumacher's era in the late 90s and early 2000s, it could be argued that the drivers were much more competitive on average due to there being less money in the sport and therefore meant a higher level of talent because there were no drivers paying their way into Formula 1. However, you could also argue during Hamilton's era of the 2010s that there was much more attention on Formula 1 on a global scale, and so the pool of prospective drivers pushing to get to F1 was higher, meaning those that did get into Formula 1 faced much more competition on the way up. Now, all of this is true. The issue is it's hard to decipher how much of an impact it would have had in affecting how Schumacher or Hamilton performed. However, there is one point that in my mind means the statistics I mentioned before are not representative of their level of talent, and that is unreliability. For Hamilton, he's developed the reputation of not suffering many DNFs. While that is partly due to him not making many mistakes and being calculated, a large part of that is to do with a level of reliability that has been engineered into the car by his team. So Hamilton knows his car is very unlikely to have an engine failure or hydraulics issue that would end a race through no fault of his own. However, when it comes to Schumacher and unreliability, it is a very different story. Instead, while the Ferrari was still a relatively reliable car, he did face many more DNFs as a result of something breaking on the car, which ultimately isn't his fault. Now the reason for this is simply the difference in technology and engineering from the late 90s, early 2000s to the 2010s, with the cars engineered to a much higher standard today with very little chance of technical failure. And the statistic to support this is the fact Hamilton has suffered 29 DNFs in his career, which is 9.4% of all races, whereas Schumacher has suffered over double that at 67 DNFs, 21.9% of races. The next reason that makes comparing the two so difficult is the difference in requirements they had as drivers. The climate of Formula 1 massively changed in the 15 to 20 years between Schumacher's dominance and Hamilton's dominance, and so naturally the drivers have to adapt themselves to that changing environment. Such changes include much improved telemetry and technology, allowing the cars to go much faster and requiring the drivers to have a deeper understanding of the technical side of the cars, as well as the massive changes in external pressures on drivers through the rise of social media and the digital world, requiring drivers to be skilled away from the racetrack in media training and personality. These massively different sporting climates mean both drivers face different pressures, and therefore comparing them seems illogical. Right, so all in all, as mentioned, these drivers competed at very different times, with the sport having very different contexts. We can always look at the statistics or level of competition and debate as who is better, where in my opinion there is simply no point. The only way we would have known for sure is if they both competed in the sport at the same time, driving for the same team, with both of them in their prime, which we all know is impossible. Both Michael Schumacher and Lewis Hamilton have been a dominant force in Formula 1. They have both revolutionised how we perceive the sport and both demand enormous respect.